Welcome back, Deep Divers. Today we're going old school, way back to 1936.
Ooh, that's pretty old school.
It is, right? We're diving into Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. And it's kind of crazy that this book is still topping bestseller lists almost a century later.
Yeah, it really is incredible. You'd think a book about human interaction from almost 100 years ago would be, hopelessly outdated.
Yeah.
But Carnegie, he tapped into something really timeless, didn't he? The core human desire to connect, and to make an impact.
Absolutely. And he didn't just write theory, right? He
Sure.
gave us practical tools to use in our lives.
Yeah, practical tools.
So today we're going to unpack some of those techniques, understand why they work, and see how you can put them to use in your own life.
Sounds great.
Yeah, it should be fun. What's fascinating to me, one of the many fascinating things about this book is how Carnegie illustrates these principles through stories of people. You wouldn't expect from Abraham Lincoln all the way to, believe it or not, Al Capone.
Oh.
Al Capone, yeah. It really shows you how universal these desires for connection and influence are, regardless of who you are or what you do.
Totally.
So, okay, let's dive into part one, fundamental techniques in handling people. So the first principle that Carnegie hits us with is don't criticize, condemn, or complain.
Don't criticize, condemn, or complain.
Seems straightforward, right? But then he just throws this wild story in there about Two Gun Crowley, a notorious gangster.
Two Gun Crowley.
Yeah, Two Gun Crowley. Even as he's facing execution, Crowley insists, this is what I get for defending myself.
Wow.
It's kind of a perfect example of how deeply ingrained self-justification is in human nature, right? Instead of just taking responsibility, even when you're facing overwhelming evidence, we look for ways to, shift blame or rationalize our actions.
It's so true.
And think about it. You've probably seen this in your own life, right?
But absolutely.
Maybe at work, in your relationships, or even in your own, internal dialogue.
All the time.
Yeah, totally. So, but Carnegie doesn't just stop at gangsters, right? No, he goes even further. He brings in Al Capone. And even after Al Capone lands in Alcatraz for tax evasion, he maintained that he was just, quote, giving people the lighter pleasures and being unfairly targeted.
Oh, wow.
It's wild, right? To see how this need to justify ourselves spans such vastly different personalities and situations.
It really does. It's a common thread through all of humanity, isn't it?
It really is, yeah. And that's what makes this principle so powerful, right?
I think so.
It's not just about, avoiding negativity. It's about understanding, a core aspect of human psychology.
Right.
When we criticize or when we condemn someone, we kind of trigger this immediate defensiveness in them.
Yeah.
It makes it almost impossible to even have a productive conversation, let alone try to influence their behavior.
It shuts the conversation down right away.
It does, yeah. And,
Yeah.
this isn't just true for, criminals and historical figures, right?
Right.
Carnegie highlights how Abraham Lincoln, who, he's often seen as the epitome of wisdom and compassion.
Yeah, he really is.
He initially struggled with this, too.
Oh, really?
Remember that story about General Meade after Gettysburg?
Oh, yeah. Remind me.
So Lincoln was, he was furious that Meade missed a chance to capture Lee's army, right? Potentially ending the Civil War much sooner.
Wow.
So he actually drafted this scathing letter accusing Meade of letting a golden opportunity slip away.
I bet that was a rough draft.
But here's the thing. Lincoln never sent it.
He didn't.
He never sent it. He realized that just lashing out wouldn't actually solve anything, right? Instead, he took a step back and tried to understand Meade's perspective and just recognized that criticizing Meade would probably just damage morale and make the situation even worse.
That's such a powerful lesson in leadership, I think.
Totally, yeah. It's emotional intelligence, at its finest.
Yeah.
Instead of focusing on what someone else is doing wrong, we can choose to approach the situation with empathy and understanding.
And probably get a lot further, right?
Exactly, yeah. And it actually reminds me of this quote from John Wanamaker, the department store magnate. I love this quote.
What is it?
He said, I have enough trouble overcoming my own limitations without fretting over the fact that God has not seen fit to distribute evenly the gift of intelligence.
Oh, wow.
Basically, focus on your own growth instead of criticizing others.
I love that.
It's so true, right?
It is.
It's so easy to just get caught up in judging other people's actions. But ultimately, the only person we have complete control over is ourselves, right?
That's a good point.
And that's where the real power of personal development lies, right?
Yeah.
In recognizing our own tendencies to criticize, to condemn, and to complain, and then consciously choosing a different path.
It's powerful stuff.
It is powerful. So before we move on, what's resonating with you so far?
Well, I think this idea of not criticizing, condemning, and complaining is a really tough one.
It is tough.
But I can definitely see how it would lead to better outcomes in almost every interaction.
Yeah, me too.
It's like taking the higher road, you know?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What are your initial thoughts on it? Well, I think for me, I need to be more mindful of how I'm coming across to people.
Yeah.
Because sometimes, I think I'm just offering helpful feedback.
Yeah, constructive criticism. Right.
Exactly.
But it won't be perceived as criticism.
Yeah. And that can really shut down a conversation before it even gets started.
Absolutely. It's something I'm working on too. It's a journey, right?
It is, yeah.
A lifelong journey. It is. So let's move on to part 2, 6 ways to make people like you.
Okay.
But before we jump into that, I want to hear what's resonating with you, our listeners, so far.
Yeah, let us know your thoughts.
What stands out from this first principle? What are your initial thoughts on this idea of avoiding criticism and seeking to understand? Share your takeaways with us on social media using the hashtag #DeepDiveCarnegie. We love hearing from you.
We really do.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
All right, see you in a sec.
Okay, so we've talked about avoiding negativity, but now the question is, how do we actively build those positive connections? How do we actually make people like us?
Right, right.
And thankfully, Carnegie gives us a road map in the next section. 6 ways to make people like you.
6 ways.
6 ways, and guess what the first one is?
What's that?
Something so simple, yet so powerful.
A genuine smile.
A smile.
A smile.
It's pretty simple.
It is, right. But Carnegie argues that a sincere smile, it can completely change the dynamic of an interaction.
Oh, yeah.
Especially in a professional setting.
Yeah, I can see that.
He even shares the story, I think it's a woman, who is an employment manager at a major department store.
Okay.
And she said that she would rather hire a sales clerk with a fantastic smile,
Okay.
who hadn't even finished grade school,
Wow.
than a PhD with a gloomy face.
Interesting.
It really highlights, I think, how much people value just like warmth and positivity.
Yeah, people want to be around people who make them feel good.
Exactly.
A smile, it's like an instant icebreaker. You know what I mean?
It is, yeah.
It makes people feel at ease, more comfortable,
Pretty like welcome.
Yeah.
But a smile's just the starting point, right?
Right.
Carnegie also dives into the importance of remembering names, which is something, I'll be honest, I really struggle with.
Yeah.
But he gives such compelling examples.
Like what?
Well, like Jim Varley, for instance.
Jim Farley.
Yeah, the political strategist, right?
Okay.
Behind FDR's success.
Okay.
And he was legendary for remembering names.
Yeah.
He claimed that he could recall like 50,000 people by their first names.
Oh, wow.
Which is just mind-boggling to me.
That's a lot of names.
It is a lot of names.
I can barely remember what I had for breakfast.
Right. But it just shows the impact,
Yeah.
Like the simple act can have on people.
Yeah, it makes people feel seen, like they matter.
Yeah, totally. It's like they matter to you, right?
Yeah.
And it's not just about politics.
Right.
He also talks about Napoleon III, who had this elaborate system for remembering every name he encountered.
Yeah, he'd repeat the name multiple times. He would try to link the name to their appearance. He would even write the name down on a piece of paper and tear it up.
Wow.
To create a stronger visual memory.
It seems like a lot of work.
It does, right. Yeah. But when you consider the potential payoff in terms of building rapport and influence,
yeah,
it starts to make a little more sense.
Maybe that's why he was Napoleon III.
Right. So now this brings us to one of the most crucial principles in the book, I think.
What's that?
And it's the power of being a good listener. And Carnegie, he doesn't mince words here. He just flat out says, most people are far more interested in themselves than they are in you.
Ouch.
Yeah.
It kind of hurts, but I think it's probably true.
It's true, though.
Right.
I mean, I think about it all the time, He even cites this study. I love this study.
What study is this?
By the New York Telephone Company, where they analyze hundreds of phone conversations.
Okay.
And guess what the most commonly used word was?
It's going to be I.
It was I.
I knew it. Right. I was going to say me, but I guess that's close enough.
Yeah, that's pretty close. It appeared almost 4,000 times in just 500 conversations.
That's a lot.
It's a lot. It really puts into perspective how deeply ingrained our self-centeredness can be, right?
It does, yeah.
We're all kind of walking around thinking that everyone's as interested in us as we are in ourselves,
right.
But that's rarely the case.
Not at all.
And so Carnegie's point is that just recognizing this can be a game changer in how we interact with other people.
Absolutely.
So how do we combat this me mentality?
That's the question.
So Carnegie, he says that the key is to become a genuinely interested listener.
Okay, interested listener.
He actually tells this story, I think it's at a dinner party. He was seated next to a very famous botanist.
Oh, cool.
And he captivated this botanist for hours just by asking questions
Okay.
and letting the botanist just talk about his work. And the funny thing is, afterwards, the botanist just raved about what a brilliant conversationalist Carnegie was.
That's funny.
Even though Carnegie barely said a word, it's such a good example of how powerful it can be to just kind of shift the focus from ourselves to the other person.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes all it takes to build a genuine connection is to just step back, let someone else shine.
Take the pressure off of us.
Yeah, exactly.
We don't have to be the life of the party all the time.
Totally. It's not about performing, right, or trying to impress. It's about creating a space for an authentic connection.
Yeah, like that.
Which actually ties in really nicely to another point that Carnegie makes, which is about talking in terms of other people's interests.
Oh, okay.
And he tells this great story about a bread salesman.
A bread salesman?
Yeah, a bread salesman who struggled for years to land this particular client.
Okay.
And then one day he asked the client about his hobby, which was, raising prize-winning dogs. And they spent like hours just talking about dogs.
Wow.
And guess what?
Go on.
The salesman finally closed the deal.
He did.
It's such a classic example, right, of finding common ground, connecting on a personal level.
It is, yeah.
When we take the time to understand what truly matters to someone else, we open the door to deeper, more meaningful interactions.
Yeah, and you build trust, right?
Exactly.
Which is so important.
And that trust can really be the foundation for lasting relationships.
I agree.
Both personally and professionally.
Absolutely.
And then finally, Carnegie, he emphasizes the importance of making people feel important and doing it sincerely.
Okay, make them feel important.
Yeah.
I like that.
And he tells this heartwarming story about an elderly woman, I think, who had a prized Packard.
Packard, okay.
Yeah, and she gifted this Packard to her nephew.
To her nephew, okay.
And not because he was the closest relative, but because he was the one who genuinely appreciated her possessions and her stories.
Oh, that's nice.
It really underscores how much people crave that feeling of being valued and seen.
Absolutely.
Especially, as people get older and maybe feel a little overlooked.
Yeah, you want to feel like you matter.
Totally.
You're still relevant.
It's about recognizing the inherent worth in every individual and treating them accordingly.
I like that.
And, when we do that, we not only make other people feel good, but we elevate the quality of our own interactions.
It's a win-win.
It really is a win-win. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've learned about the power of a smile, the importance of remembering names, the magic of being a good listener, the impact of talking in terms of other people's interests, and the significance of making people feel important.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. So I'm curious what's resonating with you the most.
That's a tough one.
It is a tough one.
I think for me, it's the idea of being a good listener.
Yeah.
I think that's something that I could definitely work on.
Totally.
Because I know I have a tendency to interrupt people, and to try to steer the conversation back to myself.
It's easy to do.
It is. It is. But I think if I can just focus on really listening to what the other person is saying.
Yeah.
And not just waiting for my turn to talk.
Right.
I think that would make a big difference in my relationships.
I think so too. What about you? What's resonating with you the most?
Okay, so we've learned how to handle people without offending them, how to make people like us, and now we're getting into the big one.
Yeah, the big one.
Winning people to our way of thinking.
Uh-huh.
This is what we all want to know, right?
This is it, yeah.
And Carnegie's advice in this section, I think, might surprise some people.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, he kicks it off by basically saying the best way to win an argument is to avoid it altogether.
That's interesting. Seems kind of counterintuitive.
It does, right?
Yeah.
Coming from the guy who wrote the book on winning friends and influencing people.
I know, right?
But he actually has a pretty solid rationale for this.
Okay, I'm curious.
So, Carnegie was a champion debater when he was younger.
He even taught argumentation.
Really?
But over time, he realized that arguing it rarely changes anyone's mind.
Yeah, that's true.
It just leads to defensiveness and resentment, and it makes it almost impossible to persuade anyone of anything.
You just end up more dug in, right?
Totally.
Nobody wants to admit they're wrong.
No, and he actually illustrates this point with this hilarious anecdote about Patrick J. O'Hare.
Who's that?
He was this salesman who was notorious for getting into these heated arguments with customers,
Oh, no.
especially when they would, like, criticize his company's trucks.
I can see that happening.
But then he just stumbled upon this brilliant strategy. Are you ready for this?
Yeah, tell me.
He started agreeing with them.
What, he just agree?
He would agree with them. He would, like, acknowledge their good points. He'd even praise the competitors' products.
Wow.
And it would just completely disarm these customers, right?
Yeah, I bet.
They would go from feeling combative to feeling heard and understood.
That's good tactic.
It is. He just took the wind right out of their sails.
So instead of arguing, he'd just validate their perspective.
Exactly. And Carnegie argues that this approach is way more effective than trying to, force your opinions on someone.
That makes sense.
It's about finding common ground and building rapport, even if you don't agree with everything that the other person is saying.
It's like disarming them with kindness.
It is, yeah. And this kind of ties into another key principle: acknowledging your own mistakes first.
Okay.
And he tells this really fascinating story about a German diplomat who narrowly avoided the Kaiser's wrath
Oh, boy.
by quickly admitting that he too could have made the same mistake.
That's smart.
Right. It's a very clever strategy.
Yeah, it takes the sting out of it.
Yeah, it takes a sting out of any potential criticism, and it just makes you appear more reasonable, more human.
You're like, hey, I'm not perfect either.
Exactly. And it kind of creates this sense of shared fallibility, which can be really disarming, right? And it fosters this sense of connection. You're like, hey, we're all human. We all make mistakes.
We're all in this together.
It makes the other person feel less attacked, more open to hearing your perspective.
So it's all about creating that safe space for dialogue.
Right. Along similar lines, Carnegie emphasizes the importance of respecting other people's opinions and never saying you're wrong, which goes back to that idea of just avoiding those, ego battles.
Yeah.
Even if you think someone is completely off base, there's a way to express your disagreement respectfully without making them feel foolish.
Right. You don't have to make them feel bad.
No. And he uses this example of a tax auditor who was just notorious for being tough.
Oh, yeah. I've heard of those.
But this one businessman managed to win him over, and it's so simple, by just expressing sincere admiration for his expertise.
Oh, so just butter them up a little.
Kind of, yeah. It's about appealing to their sense of pride and expertise, making them feel valued instead of threatened.
So you're basically saying, I respect your opinion, even if I don't agree with it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which can go a long way.
It really does. Okay, now we're moving into the realm of leadership, which Carnegie dedicates an entire section to.
Okay, leadership.
And he calls it Be a Leader: How to Change People Without Giving Offense or Arousing Resentment.
That's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful, yeah.
Right.
But basically, it's about inspiring cooperation without resorting to, like, force or manipulation.
Okay, I like that.
And his first point is this: the power of suggestion over direct orders.
Oh, interesting.
And he cites Owen D. Young, who's this brilliant business leader who was known for never giving direct commands.
Never.
Never. He would phrase things as suggestions or questions.
Oh, okay.
So instead of saying, do this, he'd be like, hey, what do you think of this approach?
What would you do?
You might consider this.
Yeah.
And it's such a subtle but powerful shift
Yeah.
because it gives people a sense of agency and ownership,
They're involved in the process.
Right, like they're part of the solution.
Yeah.
It invites collaboration instead of just imposing control.
It's a much better way to lead.
It is. And then this leads us to another really crucial leadership principle, which is letting others save face.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
And Carnegie, he shares the story of how General Electric handled the demotion of Charles Steinmetz, who's this brilliant engineer, but just wasn't cut out for management.
Okay.
So instead of just publicly humiliating him, which would have been so easy to do,
Yeah.
they created this new position for him, consulting engineer.
Oh, okay.
And it allowed him to maintain his dignity and his reputation while also addressing the company's needs.
That's a good solution.
It's a really good example, I think, of how to address these difficult situations with grace and empathy.
Yeah.
It's about finding solutions that benefit everyone involved without resorting to, unnecessary cruelty or drama.
We could all use a little bit of that.
Right. Okay, we can't talk about leadership without mentioning the power of praise and honest appreciation.
Right.
And Carnegie really drives this point home, arguing that most people they're starved for genuine recognition.
Yeah, I think that's true.
He tells this really sweet story about this young printer whose attitude was completely transformed after receiving very specific praise for his work.
Okay.
It wasn't just Empty flattery, right? His supervisor actually highlighted exactly what he had done well and why it mattered.
So, actually taking the time to notice.
Yes, and be specific.
Yeah, and to give genuine appreciation.
Totally. And it's not just about praising results, right? It's about acknowledging effort, creativity, and all those little everyday acts of excellence that often go unnoticed.
And that can really make somebody's day.
It really can, yeah. This ties into Carnegie's concept of giving a dog a good name.
Oh, what's that?
So essentially, it's about setting high expectations for people and then giving them the opportunity to live up to those expectations.
Okay.
It's about believing in people's potential,
So setting them up for success.
Totally.
By believing in them.
Yeah. And he illustrates this with a really heartwarming story about a struggling student who he blossomed when he was given the chance to join an advanced class.
That's nice.
It's so sweet. It's a testament to the power of believing in people and giving them the tools and support they need to succeed.
I love that.
And then finally, Carnegie emphasizes the importance of making the other person happy about doing the thing you suggest.
Oh.
He gives this example of an army sergeant who inspired his recruits to get regulation haircuts.
Oh, yeah.
By framing it as an act of leadership and setting a good example.
So instead of ordering them, he inspired them.
Yeah, he was like, hey, we're all in this together. Let's look sharp.
That's clever.
It's amazing, right? How these seemingly simple techniques can have such a profound impact on human behavior.
It really is. I mean, it all comes back to understanding human nature, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
Carnegie's principles, they're not about manipulation. They're not about trickery. They're about, tapping into those universal desires that we all have for connection, respect, and self-worth.
Absolutely.
And when we do that authentically, I think we could achieve some really incredible things.
Totally. Both personally and professionally.
Absolutely. Well, this was such a fascinating deep dive.
It was. I feel like we barely even scratched the surface of this book.
I know, right? There's so much in there.
But it's given us a lot to think about.
It has, yeah.
And hopefully some new tools to use in our lives.
That's fine.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the timeless wisdom of how to win friends and influence people. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.